It's time to set sail on Azurite seas. Is this the set where I win one? Oh, pretty please. I trigger our island and it looks like my time, but then Oswald flips a lucky dime.
Come on now, let's play some Lorcana. Just smash when Fox into Pirate Moana. We'll link in quest and never stop. Sing half the lumps like jumbo pops. A smorgasbord of lore, it's Lorcana.
We have crowned a champion of the North American continent. How about that, Katie?
I think it's great. I'm so excited. We had such a blast watching it this last weekend.
Congrats to Ed Chu.
Ed Chu, who we must have seen and interacted with, I'm sure, bumped into at some point in Texas.
Rob played against Ed Chu.
No way.
Yeah, he did.
I didn't know this.
Yeah, he said, I played against him. He destroyed me.
I guess that's encouraging to hear, though. You want someone who won the whole thing to, like, be good at Lorcana.
Yeah, he's somebody, he's a DLC champion. He won DLC Fort Worth against a guy who was cheating. So Ed Chu's pretty good.
Yeah.
Turns out he's pretty good at Lorcana, so congrats to him.
Yeah.
Got quite the haul. He posted a picture of, the playset of Enchanteds that he got. Just like this gold wall of Enchanteds.
That's so wild.
Wicked cool. Lots of Lorcana news trickling out through the weekend.
Yeah, we saw some art released this weekend.
For Lady and the Tramp.
We were once again, as we often are, ahead of the curve on this beautiful art.
Yeah, you will recall that we posted dream cards of Lady and the Tramp not so long ago.
Yeah.
Very excited to have spaghetti and meatballs represented in the game of Lorcana.
Thank goodness it's about dang time we get some pasta here.
Less obvious news, kind of reading between the lines with this next bit of news. Ravensburger is hiring somebody who knows how to make digital card games. It can only mean one thing, Katie. They're investigating creating a digital version of Lorcana.
Woo! It's about time. We have been saying, and a lot of people have been saying since they got rid of Pixelborn, that they need to find something to replace it with. It's the way a lot of people played Lorcana, and there's a lot of wonky Pixelborn knockoffs out there in the world right now that don't work perfectly, and I really, really, really would be so excited to see Lorcana on a digital platform similar to a Hearthstone. One of my favorite things about Hearthstone was that you could just log onto your computer and play whenever you wanted to. I mean, if you were home alone, you could just play the game, which is very difficult to do in Lorcana. And yes, there's all kinds of like online things you can use, but they're messy and clunky, and it's just not quite the same.
I just hope that once they do publish this, we don't have to repurchase cards. That would be the worst.
Oh man, that would be terrible.
Yeah, can you imagine having to each track down sets of cards?
No, I hope they don't do that.
I think there's a likelihood that you will have to make an account that will not be shareable, and you'll have to reacquire all of the cards.
That would be insane.
I think that's what will happen, so we'll just have to cross our fingers that that's not the case.
I can't see that being the case. I could see it maybe being like a monthly fee to play.
That would be
online,
okay, yeah.
Because they know they have to make some kind of money from it, because otherwise people could just play Lorcana for free. That makes me so nervous. I hadn't thought about that.
Yeah, I think it could be bad or worse, right? It would be worse if there are indeed individual accounts, and for instance, if we both wanted to play, we would have to have our own accounts. And so we'd each be tracking down 4 Maui Hero to all, and 4 Foxes, et cetera, et cetera. That could be rough. So we'll see how it all shakes out. High hopes, though. High hopes, and fingers crossed.
Hopefully they hire the right person for this job and they figure out a beautiful solution for it.
Speaking of launching new endeavors, we have a new Smorcana endeavor.
Boy, do we ever.
We set up a tip jar.
Yeah. Similar to the Tip Top Club at the top of the Hollywood Tower of Terror in Disney World, a Tip Top jar. Brett, what is a Tip Top jar?
It's basically exactly what it sounds like. It's an online tip jar. So we put some work into the podcast over the past year. It takes some time, and we have had a few folks ask us about ways to thank us. And if you were so inclined and you did want to, thank us with a monetary contribution, you can go to tiptopjar.com/smorkana, and we'll link that in our show notes going forward. But, if you feel like dunking $1 or $2 into the online tip jar, we would really appreciate it. It would be awesome to eventually defray the cost of our podcast equipment. I think that's like a pretty modest goal and maybe one that's achievable.
Indeed. That's the dream here, folks. Just a little bit, just to keep us afloat in this beautiful Smorkana cafe so we can continue bringing you delightful snacks.
I mean, if we got $1 from like every person who listens to an episode of the podcast, then we'd be pretty happy.
Millionaires. We'd be millionaires.
We might be thousandaires.
Hey, what else is coming up here in the world of Lorcana, Brett?
Well, set champs rapidly approach. A new set championship has appeared.
Cannot wait for that.
4 weeks of nonstop thrills, nonstop action.
Wow.
Are you attending any on the first weekend, Katie?
No.
Aww.
I have to work.
Aww.
Yeah. But you are.
I am, yeah.
Tell us about what you're doing here.
Going to Portsmouth Diversions on Saturday.
Okay.
Might make the trip up to a weekend anime in Maine on Sunday. Might do 2 because you're busy all weekend anyway. So what else am I going to do?
Exactly.
What would you play if you were going to set champs? Should we even talk about this or should we dive right into the appetizers?
Well, this tastes a little bit like an appetizer to me. So let's hop on in.
Hey guys, how's it going?
Hey, Toby, we're doing great. How are you doing?
Oh, I'm doing just fine. Can I get you started with some apps, some appies, some appetizers?
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, what would you like?
Boy, that's a great question. I think we're gonna go for an appetizer sampler.
You sure? Kind of like lame.
Yeah, I mean, it's got everything we want. It has French fries and chicken tenders and potato skins, mozzarella sticks.
All right, if that's what you want, that's what I'll get you, I guess. All right, I'll put that in. I think you might regret it, but I'll put that in.
Thanks, Toby.
Why was he so, maybe they're a little too conventional for him.
Yeah, those snacks are a little too on meta for him.
Yeah, I guess we weren't too adventurous, but, that's kind of the mood we're in, I guess. Especially given the state of the Lorcana metagame.
Oh, wait a minute. It's almost like this appetizer sampler is a perfect time to give a little overview of the current meta.
Because just like a conventional appetizer platter with French fries and chicken fingers, these decks are decks you've seen before, they're classics, they're tried and true, and nothing will surprise you.
Nothing will surprise you. If we've said it once this set, we've said it 1,000 times. Nothing will surprise you. If you're playing decks and you have a feeling of emptiness inside, that's normal for this set. It's just normal.
And that's not to say it's not balanced, right? Or enjoyable, because there is a lot of balance and there are a lot of decks that can win a set champ. But I think one of the reasons we're not focusing on this as a whole episode is that it feels like a retread and that we'd just be repeating a lot of what a lot of other content creators are talking about,
Yes.
We could theoretically sort all these decks into a tier list and talk about them, but it's, you know these decks. You've seen them before. We're going to cover everything briefly, but there's not a whole lot to report on.
Exactly. So let's start with a standard that just simply can't go away. We've got Ruby Sapphire still out there.
Yeah, Ruby Sapphire is probably the most powerful deck right now. You can expect to see a lot of it. It made up, over 30% of the Continentals deck lists.
Wow,
Yeah.
I didn't realize it was all the way at 30%.
Over 30%, and it represented that well in the top 16. And a Ruby Sapphire list also made it all the way to the finals, so there's no reason to think that Ruby Sapphire will be going away or dropping in presence. You'll definitely see it at set champs.
Certainly, and for those of you maybe who haven't gotten a lot of practice in this current meta, it's as annoying as it always was.
Yeah, it has made a few additions, most notably Maui Shark is a big part of the deck now, also a Pirate's Life. So you have this little package of Maui Shark and some new actions, and that's kind of their new win condition. A lot of them are only running 1 lucky dime. They're less reliant on Tamatoa and the dime, and they often can win games more incrementally with the shark and some of those actions. You can also expect to see Ruby Amethyst.
Boy, do I love Ruby Amethyst. And even as somebody who truly and deeply adores Ruby Amethyst, and I love playing that deck, it comes to me naturally. I have a good time with it. I'll probably bring it to at least one set champ. I am bored by this deck. It's just that it's similar. It's similar to what it's been before. It's got a bounce package. Flynn Rider's back. He's doing pretty well with Sisu. There's some of the new genie, the evasive genie that draws a card. And that's cool and spicy, I suppose. But that's pretty much it.
Yeah, the genie's spicy like salt is spicy.
Yeah, I mean, he adds flavor. It's not like he's blowing me away and I'm like, oh my god, where do we get this spice rub? But it is flavorful.
It is technically a new card that is now prevalent in Ruby Amethyst.
Would I have preferred it to be Mama Odie, who worked out in a Ruby Amethyst deck? Yeah, but it's not the case.
You might see a little bit less of Genie because Ed Chu was not running any Genies in his list, notably. He had teched his list very specifically to beat Ruby Sapphire, and Genie's not that great of a card against Ruby Sapphire because they can just brawl it away. So you might see a little bit less of Genie just because I think some people will be copycats. I don't think that's a good idea to cut Genie from Ruby Amethyst, just generally because, you know, I don't think you'll see quite as much Ruby Sapphire at set champs. I don't think 35% of your set champ field is going to be Ruby Sapphire.
And if it is, whoa.
Ruby Amethyst is still just that classic mid-range deck. It has Be Prepared. It can surprise you with Flynn and Sisu, especially going first. So the same kind of versatile deck it's always been. The cockroach of Lorcana.
Yes, the cockroach indeed.
What else are we seeing out there, Katie?
We're seeing some diggy diggy hole, or as I like to call it, piggy piggy hole. And Steel Song. We're seeing some Amber Steel action out here.
Yep. Diggy Diggy Hole is a fast Amber Steel list. It uses Happy and Doc along with Seven Dwarfs Mine to control the board a little bit, but mostly it just plays a bunch of characters that quest for a lot, and it goes very quickly. It doesn't have the same weakness to Ruby Sapphire that a traditional Steel Song build does.
And what I will say about Diggy Diggy Hole, I've had the pleasure of playing it a couple of times recently, and I do like how different it feels from other decks. You know, I like that I'm getting to use Seven Dwarfs Mine and I'm using Doc and Happy, and it feels a little bit fresher than some of the other decks we're seeing in the meta right now, and I think that's where I have the most fun with it, I suppose. Lilo's in there too. It's you know, there's certainly more spice than just salt in this deck.
And that's coming from somebody who played a whole lot of Amber Steel aggro or like no aerial Steel Song last set.
Yeah, definitely. Yep, me and Amber Steel are old buddies.
The next kind of group of decks that you can expect to see are all of the other Amethyst decks. You could see Emerald Amethyst, Amethyst Steel, Blurple, maybe even an Amber Amethyst deck with Mufasa and like Perdita. They're all very similar in that they're all going to be running those 1-drops that replace themselves. They're going to be running Elsas and Genies and maybe Bell Accomplished Mystic. They're going to have the Mim and Merlin bounce package. Like, there's a shell of Amethyst cards that runs through all of these decks. They all play reasonably similarly. Blurple, you know, delays to the late game a bit more. The Steel version has a bit more removal. The Emerald version can go probably the fastest of all of the decks. So they're all similar with a few different cards that alter their matchup spread just a little bit. Something you definitely want to be prepared for is the Genie Wars, all of the interactions with Genie. If you are playing one of these decks, anticipating your opponent's Genie and your opponent's Elsa and your opponent's Belle goes a long way. One of the advantages that Blurple has is that you get to play potentially your Genie a turn earlier, and so that helps you to trade into your opponent's Genie without losing your own. But just that back and forth that a Genie followed by a Genie followed by an Elsa creates is important to consider. I, for one, am abstaining from the Genie Wars. I don't think I want to engage in them at all. I'd rather find different answers to the Genie than go through that kind of like rote gameplay over and over.
It makes sense. It's not necessarily fun. I mean, it's kind of self-defeating to start that kind of a war with an evasive genie. Guess what's not gone?
What's that?
Discard.
Ugh.
Gross. Die.
Could be a sneaky good pick going into your set championships. Not a lot of folks are playing discard, but it showed up really well. I mean, Zan Syed made a really deep run with an Emerald Steel list that was teched with some options for the Ruby Sapphire matchup, just some extra Cursed Merfolks and the like to go a little bit faster than you might expect.
It's as powerful as it was, and it's still, I think, fun to play into a lot of the decks that we're seeing in the meta. If you like playing discard, if you like getting rid of someone else's cards, if that's something that you enjoy for some crazy reason, then like Brett said, it's probably a good sneaky choice that people might not see coming.
Definitely have to be aware of aggro. You're going to see a lot of folks show up to tournaments who maybe haven't been to League lately, or maybe their families, they're newer players, etc. You see more aggro than you might expect at these set championships. And so something to be mindful of. If you are bringing, Ruby Sapphire, I think it's worth including a few extra anti-aggro cards at the set championships than you might otherwise. Like, throw a couple of Queen of Hearts in there, be ready with your human Sisus, that kind of thing.
Exactly. Always be on the look for aggro. I don't think aggro is a style of deck that will ever go away, because it's not necessarily one deck that is aggro. There are a lot of different decks that can be made in an aggro style, so definitely being prepared for aggro is a good idea. Otherwise, you could lose and enter a whole new world.
So not a lot of major developments. That's really been the theme of this set. We're not seeing entirely new archetypes pop up and do very well. Yeah, you might see a rogue Ruby Steel pirate list here and there. You might see a rogue Lemon Lime list here and there. You'll probably see me playing Sapphire Steel at some point, So if you have experience with past metagames, you can definitely rely on that experience. There aren't so many new cards to wrap your head around. Well, that was a filling, if not overly exciting appetizer. Want to order something a little bit more substantial?
Yeah, maybe something with a little bit of health to it, a little more protein here.
How did you enjoy your appetizer?
Toby, it was really good, actually. I mean, we like all those foods. They're
I'm
fun
so
snacks.
glad you enjoyed it. Now I'm happy to present something a little more, interesting. Something that doesn't make you fall asleep when you look at it.
Okay.
This is a finely aged beef tenderloin presented on a parsnip puree. Enjoy.
Whoa, this is, exceptionally fancy.
Whoa, this looks amazing.
Aged beef, fancy out here.
Katie, you know what this dish reminds me of?
What?
The long and storied history of trading card games.
Wow!
We recognize that a lot of our listeners could be coming to card games having not played many before. And so I thought it would be fun to take a look back at the history of trading card games and collectible card games and look at how we got to this point with Lorcana. Look at Lorcana's place in the history of this type of game.
Love that. I know very little about this, so why don't you give us a little rundown here, Brett? Give us a history lesson.
So Lorcana's grandpa, as it were, the progenitor of Lorcana, is Richard Garfield, who invented Magic the Gathering. You've probably heard of Magic the Gathering. You've heard us on this podcast talk about Magic the Gathering.
Yes.
You can't ignore the impact that Magic the Gathering has had on trading card games. It was the first trading card game.
Wow, of all time.
Yes, the very first one. It's not like it perfected them. It's not like, there were a bunch before it and for some reason it became the biggest one. No, it was the first trading card game.
And when did this come out? What are we talking, 70s?
So we're talking about the early 90s when this was released to the public. Richard Garfield is a math dude. He has a doctorate in math. Good with the numbers. Yeah.
Who would do that?
And he was also a big fan of Dungeons and Dragons, which was huge through the 80s and grew all through the 80s. and he noticed that there was a lot of downtime in between games, and so he wanted to create something that was fast and portable and could be played in downtime at conventions and such. Dungeons & Dragons was also a huge influence on Magic. The world of Dungeons & Dragons, that kind of stereotypical high fantasy universe, was instrumental in the theming of Magic the Gathering. But the idea that the rules of a board game, effectively, could be overwritten with cards is really new. Like, there's the golden rule in Magic, and this is carried over to a ton of card games since, that what a card does overrides the traditional rules of the game was a completely new idea. So, like, for instance, in games beforehand, a board game, you might, like, draw a card at the start of your turn, but there was never a card that then enabled you to draw extra cards or, like, said, now you draw 2 cards at the start of your turn. Just the idea that the rules of the game could be usurped by a card was completely new.
I hadn't thought about that. The fact that, you're transitioning from card games like Canasta or Gin Rummy, and you're transitioning from board games like Chutes and Ladders.
Yeah, and this isn't the only innovation that Magic brought to this space. The idea that collectible cards themselves could be game pieces, that you could choose which cards you wanted to construct a deck. Even something like turning your card 90 degrees to indicate that it had been used for the turn, what in Magic is called tapping. These are all ideas that were completely new to board gaming, to gaming, and they were all invented by Richard Garfield with Magic.
Damn.
So this premiered at Origins, the Origins convention in 1993, and then it was released for purchase at Gen Con in 1993.
And it blew everybody's mind, and it was instantly famous.
It did. So the publisher was Wizards of the Coast. Wizards of the Coast, a huge company now. They were not huge before Magic. Magic made Wizards of the Coast, just like Wizards of the Coast made Magic.
Nice. That makes a lot of sense. I feel like anyone who touched Magic probably has millions of dollars right now.
Yeah, it's an insanely lucrative business. It's worth, billions of dollars at this point. And their original patent for the game included all of that language about using cards as game pieces, about constructing a deck, about tapping. So yeah, it's been a cash cow, to say the least. It was instantly popular. It sold out everywhere through 1994. Its initial print run, the alpha print run, was extremely hard to get. It sold out instantly everywhere. It's really, really, really rare to find any sealed product. It's worth quite a lot of money.
Yeah, not dissimilar to a game we know and love that rhymes with Lorcana.
Yeah, so the hype that Magic had around it feels a lot like the hype that Lorcana had when it was first published, for sure.
I wonder if that scarcity of product was on purpose to kind of like mimic what had happened with Magic.
That's always a possibility. There's speculation about that, with video game consoles sometimes with different toys. Like, yeah, that's definitely a possibility. But I think what it really boils down to is it's hard to measure the demand, hard to anticipate how invested folks are going to become in these games for reasons that we're going to get into.
Sure.
So there are lots of funny things that weren't anticipated when they released Magic. For instance, sleeves did not exist.
Wow.
So, you have players who are playing naked cards, right? They're not anticipating that their cards are someday going to be worth thousands and tens of thousands of dollars in some cases, right? So you have cards just being played without sleeves.
Ugh.
A lot of times they were played for ante, like you would bet cards to keep whenever you played.
Oh my gosh.
That whole secondary market was not anticipated. Like, how could they have known that a Black Lotus, which famously is like the most valuable Magic card, would be worth tens of thousands of dollars someday?
Right.
They didn't anticipate, interestingly, min-maxing. Like, Richard Garfield was not thinking that players would try to get, 4 copies of the most powerful card and then, really hone their deck to make them as good as they possibly could be. It was more like the casual way you probably started playing Lorcana if you hadn't played card games before, where yeah, you start out with like a little starter pack and like you get some new cards and maybe you try them out and maybe it's a little bit better or a little bit worse. And maybe you bet one of them when you play against your opponent. You know, it was not a thing where you're like, oh, I only need one more Black Lotus, and then I like flesh out my deck entirely to be this powerhouse.
Yeah, right.
But pretty quickly, players started to min-max and push the game to its limit and, you know, play at a professional level in tournaments and things.
Yeah, that's wild. I remember a while ago we were watching a video about, I think it was cheating scandals in Magic, and you look back at some of those tournaments from the 90s and they're just like shuffling the heck out of these raw cards, and it is shocking to watch.
Yeah, and it's playing on like MTV, and they're like, this is the bad boy of Magic. And he's got like sunglasses on, you know, he's got like a blazer. He looks like he's walked out of Miami Vice or something. Yeah, it was a wild time. There was a craze all through 1994 or 1995, the CCG craze. You had a ton of copycats start entering the market pretty immediately.
Wow.
You had Steve Jackson of Munchkin fame trying to make CCGs. You had Decipher, which is a company we'll talk a little bit more about, with a Star Trek knockoff. You had a failed Middle-earth game, a Lord of the Rings styled game. Yep. You had Legend of the Five Rings, which is one of the few games that kind of lived on past this initial craze. But with the craze brought the fall. There were too many products. There weren't enough players. It was all a little bit too niche. And it was all marketed really heavily to hardcore gamers, people who already played similar games, right? Board games or role-playing games. Wizards of the Coast had ballooned up in size, but then had to downsize in 1995. So you had this initial huge wave of interest in Magic, a bunch of copycats, and then that growth halted. At one point, Wizards of the Coast even tried to make a simplified version of Magic. It was called Portal, and everybody hated it.
Oh, no.
Which, you know, I think is relevant for when we talk about Lorcana a little bit later. But there were lots of failed IPs here. Everybody was trying to tie these games to IPs. I mean, you had a Babylon 5 CCG, a Dune game, an Alien/Predator game, a Xena Warrior Princess game. I mean, these were all pretty poor and didn't catch on. They lost their licenses to continue making the game based on that IP. So a lot of failed copycats through the mid-90s.
Those are such 90s IPs to go for.
Right?
Xena, Babylon 5, like what?
Yeah, I have to confess, I've never seen a Xena Warrior Princess card.
Oh, I thought you were going to say you'd never seen Xena Warrior Princess.
Oh no, I've seen what's her face? Lucy Lawless?
Yeah, in the show. Remember the TV show? I used to like the TV show.
Sure. I recognized her enough to know when she showed up in Parks and Recreation.
Fair.
So amidst all of these failed IPs, something else is happening. George Lucas decided to go back and tinker with his Star Wars trilogy. And they re-released Star Wars in the theaters as the Star Wars Special Editions. This was how I first encountered Star Wars. I quickly became obsessed.
The number one fan over here, folks. Now, were you privy as a Star Wars fan to any Star Wars card games?
One day, walking through, I believe it was Bradley's. Do you remember that department store, Bradley's?
No, I'm from New Hampshire, not Massachusetts.
Yeah, we had this like, I don't know, it's hard to compare it to something. It was like a junky Walmart called Bradley's. And sitting on one shelf, like a clearance shelf, kind of discarded, was this box of Star Wars customizable card game cards. It was a little 2-player starter set. And this quickly became the biggest card game outside of Magic the Gathering. So this is around 1997 when this comes around. It got around some of the patent problems by not having that tapping/exerting mechanic. Some other features were that your deck was your point total in a way. You won by completely decking your opponent. Basically, your deck was your quote-unquote life force. Everything was also a lot more literal, like you had locations that were laid out and characters had to exist at those locations and be at the locations at the same time as your opponent's characters in order to battle. You also had decks that were separated light versus dark. So in any given game, you could play either the light side or the dark side. So a very different game mechanically from Magic. A lot more complicated in a lot of ways.
Yeah, I have not played this with you before. someday I hope that we will dig it up and get to play together, because it's the origin of how you became the card player that you are. It's like, what made you? I have to know about the source.
Yeah, I didn't play a lot. I mostly played against myself, or organized my cards, or looked at them, or just kind of imagined what it would be like to play them. I went to a single tournament in my time as a Star Wars CCG player. You know, I was 8 to 12 years old when I was playing. Went to a single tournament and got absolutely destroyed. So talking about min-maxing, I had put cards in my deck that I liked. I had my single copy of Obi-Wan Kenobi, you know, that I hoped I saw over the course of the game. And
you only need one.
Yeah. I
There's
got
one guy.
absolutely wrecked by, you know, adults playing fully, you know, min-max decks. But I had a great time, and it was an eye-opening experience. And I got a lot of cards for free. You know, like they offloaded their bulk cards to me. So that was really, really cool. And I think it hooked me going to that one tournament as a child.
That's so great. I feel like that's a short story in and of itself. It's just, I can see that in you as a card player right now, and that you're always trying to help out new players and give them cards from the bulk bin and all that kind of stuff. That spirit of trading card games is cool. Really cool to see that through line.
Yeah. And you know, my little sister also went to that tournament. She must have been 7 at the time.
Dang.
And because I'm, you know, sure to these adults, she was like this cute little kid who like had no clue what she was doing really. I mean, knew the basic rules, but had horrible cards. She got so many free cards.
Yeah.
I remember she got this like crazy Boba Fett card from one other player, and I was so jealous. But, you know, it was really awesome. But this game was so wild. It was wild, Katie. There were cards that you would never see in Lorcana. So there was a card called Hindsight, and the whole thing was printed as a mirror image, and it was, you know, C-3PO and his head is on backwards.
Oh my gosh.
So like the card text was literally a mirror image.
How would you read it?
You just like would, I guess, you know, like you're just expected to kind of read it. I don't know, like, or expected to know what it did. I mean, it wasn't a very good card, so I don't think a lot of people played it, but, you know, they just did really strange things. There was a card called Brainiac, you know, everybody's favorite Star Wars character, Brainiac.
Oh, right. Brainiac from Star Wars.
Yeah. He had a number value that was just pi.
What? Like olive pie?
Yeah, like he had like 3.14 destiny, but it was the symbol for pi.
That's crazy.
Yeah. And so, you know, it was a wild time. They had to print like gigantic rule books just to explain how individual cards worked, called the glossary. They had this little glossary. So a wild time. There was a mechanic whereby cards cycled from the top of your deck, then you use them as a resource, and then they went to the bottom of your deck. So it's possible to count cards. This was relevant because very often you would flip cards off the top of your deck, and the destiny value, this like one number value, was used to calculate like how much damage you would do in a battle. And so really good players would track cards with high destiny values from the bottom all the way to the top of their deck, and they would know when that card was on the top of their deck so that they could flip it at the right time and do a lot of damage in a battle. It was called destiny tracking. It is extremely difficult to do. I think I achieved it once in my entire time playing the game, but I don't think it was necessarily intended when they designed the game. It was just a byproduct of the way it was designed. So it was a wild game, super complicated, but it had Obi-Wan and Luke and Darth Vader and the Emperor and like X-Wings and stuff. So, you know, if you were a Star Wars fan, it was amazing.
Yeah.
Had lots of deep cuts. I learned so much Star Wars trivia from playing that game. Like, you know, I know that the name of the Kowakian monkey lizard in Jabba's palace was named Salacious Crumb.
Obviously.
Because of that game, you know? I know everybody in Jabba's palace's band name.
I mean, that makes sense. I feel like that's similar for Lorcana for people who might not know, you know, minor characters. I don't know if you don't know the name of Jumba Jukiba, right? You know it now from Lilo and Stitch.
Yeah, it was a lot like that. So Star Wars comes along. It's the next big card game. That's all through the late 90s. It runs close behind Magic for a little bit. And then a little game called Pokemon comes along in 1999.
Gotta catch 'em all. It's you and me. I know it's my
So
destiny.
Wizards of the Coast also made Pokemon. It obviously became a huge fad. It actually outsold Magic for a year from 1999 to 2000.
Wow.
It was the first time that these cards started to be sold in places like Target and Walmart.
I mean, I remember Pokemon vividly from elementary school and people trading it on the playground. And it was like just insanity with Pokemon.
Yeah, even if you didn't play the game, you probably had a couple of the cards. You probably traded them at some point if you were a child of this age.
I remember I never had Pokemon cards. And one time I was with my grandparents and we got Happy Meals. And there were Pokemon cards in the Happy Meals. And I obviously knew of Pokemon. And to my grandparents, it was like Pokemon was the devil. And my sister and I were like, oh yeah, we don't really play Pokemon. We don't really need these cards. And they were like, oh, good. Thank goodness. And I just remember that so well. It was as if Pokemon cards were like drugs. And they were like, no grandchild of mine has Pokemon cards. But, I bet if we had opened those Pokemon cards in our 1999 Happy Meals, they'd probably be worth something now.
Yeah, I mean, I recently dug up my very small collection of Pokemon cards from my mother's attic, literally, brought them to a local store and got like $300 in store credit.
Boom.
So yeah, they're still cooking. They're still making Pokemon cards. It's still the second biggest trading card game, has been for 25 years now. They did have a lull kind of after that initial fad where Wizards of the Coast lost the license and the Pokemon Company themselves started making the cards. But the important thing to come out of this era was that there was once again a wave of copycats. So now you have Harry Potter card games and Buffy the Vampire card games, and Yu-Gi-Oh! Was born out of this same time period, and in fact became the top collectible card game for a bit as well. So Pokemon and Yu-Gi-Oh! Born in 1999 and 2001-ish respectively. Then you get my second game, and the first game that I ever really played competitively, the Lord of the Rings game by Decipher, the same company that made Star Wars CCG.
Right. Okay. So this is different from the Lord of the Rings LCG that we've played together.
Yes. So this was, again, a trading card game, one that you could collect that had like foils and such. You played a deck that was a combination light and dark side deck. Basically, you had to move your fellowship 9 steps closer to Mount Doom while also stopping your opponent from doing the same. It was kind of a race. It was really fun. Yeah, I played it all through high school.
I love that.
I
That's
have
really
to
cool.
confess, I did not tell the girls about that.
You didn't use it as a line?
No, I was kind of a closet gamer there.
You didn't bring cards into school and show them to everybody?
No, I didn't, because, this is still a time where these kinds of games were marketed to the hardcore players, folks who already were interested in Lord of the Rings and Dungeons and Dragons and Star Wars, etc., etc.
Fair. I don't blame you for not telling any people about it.
But it was briefly the top card game in 2002 because the Lord of the Rings came out in 2001 through 2003. It was really fun. I love that game. I still have the cards, but it was, not marketed to the mainstream. You wouldn't have found it in Target, for instance.
Right.
So you have market saturation at this point, basically through the 2000s. You've got Yu-Gi-Oh! And Pokemon and Lord of the Rings and Magic. You get more knockoffs with SpongeBob, Ninja Turtles, Inuyasha, The Simpsons, Wheel of Time, Digimon. A lot of failed card games throughout this time period.
Yeah, I didn't even know a lot of those had card games.
And basically, a lot of the mechanics are extremely similar between all of these games. You are relying on the IP. And very often, these companies would get the license to make a base set and maybe one expansion, and then it would end. They would lose the license. It would expire. So you're not really attracting a bunch of new players with all of these different IPs. I do want to mention living card games, which were published by Fantasy Flight in 2009 and onward. These included a Netrunner reboot, a Star Wars living card game, Warhammer, Cthulhu, and the one that I played, Game of Thrones.
Yeah, you were big into Game of Thrones. When we first started dating, you told me about Game of Thrones. Speaking of not telling ladies about card games, you told me all about, and I thought it was very impressive.
Yeah, I had competed a lot with Game of Thrones. I had competed nationally, competed at Gen Con and other kind of big conventions, and had done really well at that scale of event. And so that's where I kind of became the card game player that I am now, is playing Game of Thrones. Living card games were mechanically similar to all of these other games we've been talking about, but the release model was very different. So instead of having booster packs and relying on random purchases to build your decks, periodically you would buy what they called chapter packs, and you would get a full play set of 20 or so cards, say. So there was no random element. Everybody had the same card pool, and you always had a play set of every card. So you didn't have to spend as much money, which was very appealing to me throughout my 20s. Being able to get the cards that I needed at a very affordable price point was really cool. I thought that the release model for living card games was really great.
I have played living card games with you before. We've played the Game of Thrones LCG together, and we've played the Lord of the Rings LCG.
Yep, Lord of the Rings being an LCG that is cooperative. They are still publishing that game. They've repackaged some of the chapter packs together so that you don't have to have as many different items, right? You can get one box that has a full play sets of 120 different cards instead of just 20 different cards. So they've changed up the release model, they've evolved, but they made really, really good games. And a lot of these games have really excellent innovations, twists on this old formula of, like playing creatures to the board and then having them fight each other. Game of Thrones, for instance, has the plot mechanic where you have a separate deck of plots, and each turn you choose a plot from your deck to play, and that determines how each round unfolds to a large extent. So just really cool mechanics, lots of evolution, lots of refining of the formula that Magic introduced. Of course, all the meanwhile, Magic is getting bigger and bigger and bigger.
Magic, it seems like, has stayed pretty consistently relevant.
It is the number one card game. It has been the number one card game. Every now and then, for a month or two, maybe as much as a year, a card game will knock it aside. But at this point, it's really hard to topple the behemoth that is Magic. The 2010s really were dominated by that big three. It's been 15 years leading up to the release of Lorcana, where you have Magic, Pokemon, and Yu-Gi-Oh! Really being the leaders in card games.
Yeah, I mean, those are certainly the first three that I ever would have thought of before I got into this world and before I met you and I knew about other card games. If someone said, "Quick, what are some trading card games that are played?" That's all that have ever been familiar with. I know we've overheard some people talking about Flesh and Blood at some card stores. Some people play that game.
Yeah, every now and then a game pops up and makes a splash for sure. Flesh and Blood made a splash for a couple years there, with a focus on gaming in person while Magic was moving increasingly online. So, yeah, some games make splashes, but those have been the big three. Quick shout out to all of the Star Wars games that have ever come out, because there have been so many. I believe Decipher, apart from the original Star Wars CCG, released 2 more card games that were supposed to be simplified versions called like Young Jedi or Jedi Knights or something like that. There was Star Wars Destiny, which was a card game with dice that Fantasy Flight tried to promote. You have the Star Wars LCG. So many Star Wars games leading up to their current Star Wars Unlimited. And that's one of the reasons that I would never consider buying into that game, is because I've seen 7, 8, 9 different collectible Star Wars card games come and go over the years.
Insane.
But this brings us to Lorcana and its place in the history of trading card games.
Yeah, it sure does. How did we get here? How did we get to Lorcana? Why did it take so long? What was Disney doing all these years?
Well, Disney's so protective of its IP. And you'll notice that throughout the history that we just kind of laid out, there were so many intellectual properties that were used as like a quick cash grab and then discarded. And the quality of the game didn't matter as much as, hey, do you like the Ninja Turtles? Maybe you'll like this Ninja Turtle card game. Right? So Disney being so protective of its IPs, it makes a lot of sense that they would have waited so long to try this for themselves.
Yeah, they're not going to let anybody crumple up and toss away Mickey Mouse.
Right. And they trusted Ravensburger. They had made Villainous beforehand and a few other Disney board games. They have Disney puzzles, et cetera, et cetera. So it's a company that they trusted. And I think that they wanted to make sure that when they did eventually release their IP, they were doing it right.
Yeah.
So we often say on this podcast, like, this game didn't have to be as good in terms of gameplay as it is. It would have probably done pretty well just being a Disney card game. But what's going to give it staying power is the fact that the gameplay is good. It is a streamlined version of a lot of games that have come before it. It's an evolution of game design. Like, I don't know how you could argue that Magic is a better designed game than Lorcana.
Yeah, I don't see that either.
Now, of course, Magic is super important in the history of card games. Lorcana wouldn't exist without Magic, but Magic is like the Snow White to Lorcana's Frozen.
Yeah, definitely. It's like a cake to eggs. You need eggs to make a cake, but cake is so much better than eggs.
Mm-hmm. Now, the other thing that Lorcana has going for it, and, trying to find its place in the history of card games, trying to put it on the timeline to try to anticipate its future, I think that we've never had a card game with as big, as popular, as pervasive an IP as Lorcana. Star Wars comes close. Disney is bigger than Xena Warrior Princess for sure. It's bigger than Ninja Turtles. It's bigger than SpongeBob. It's bigger than all of those put together. When you think about the fact that Lorcana includes Aladdin and Snow White and Frozen and Moana and is going to include Pixar, like, nothing comes close. This is such a touchstone for so many people. You have all of that opportunity for crossover marketing at their parks, with the cruise lines, with film releases, on and on and on and on.
Yeah, we've talked about that many times before, about how, lucky we are that Lorcana has the Disney IP and how huge Disney is in the world and how they can use the parks and they can use all those things to their advantage, especially for this game. We'd love to play Lorcana on a Disney cruise. We've played it in the Grand Canyon, but boy, we'd love to play it inside of a Disney park. We've ripped packs in Disneyland.
Yeah, so there are all of these memories that you can create with Lorcana, these Disney-specific memories that you just couldn't do with any game. There's never been a game tied to an IP like this. And that's comforting because as two people who are really invested in this game, both financially and pseudo-spiritually and with this podcast, it's exciting to have the confidence that this will be around for years to come. I also hope that they carry that spirit of innovation that Disney is famous for through as the game develops.
Yeah, I mean, the spirit of Disney is to keep moving forward and keep making changes all the time. Walt Disney famously said when he created Disneyland that he hoped that it would continue changing through time and space. And he said, if anything, I know the trees will continue to grow and make the place even more beautiful. So that I totally agree that as long as Disney's a part of Lorcana, it will continue to change.
There's a great big beautiful tomorrow
Shining at the end of every game.
So when Lorcana changes a rule or introduces a new mechanic, or the meta shifts wildly, or they change the art style on a card, be ready to roll with that, because that is absolutely within the spirit of Disney. And I think it's what the game will need to do to have a long and successful future and to eventually maybe become the biggest trading card game in history.
Hear, hear. Well, that was a delicious aged beef tenderloin we just had.
Yeah, I'm quite sated. I hope that was exciting, and I hope that was informative and fun to talk about.
It was so much fun. Again, like I said at the beginning, I know very little about this history of trading card games, so I am so thankful to have some more knowledge about that. But I do have to say, I think our breath kind of smells like aged beef.
We better indulge in a minty dream card.
Yes, indeed.
All right. I've procured a dream card for the week. It is a steel dream card called Geppetto Toymaker.
Yes, you seem to be inspired by our conversation about Lorcana's grandfather, and you've made the grandfather of Disney, Geppetto. Geppetto is not a card.
Yeah.
Monstro got a card. The whale from Pinocchio, but not Geppetto. Geppetto made Pinocchio.
Well, we keep speaking all of these cards into existence, like with Lady and the Tramp. So I bet that we're going to see a Geppetto in the next set. Calling it right now.
Can I call something similar?
Yeah.
I think we're going to see Figaro, the kitten from Pinocchio.
Yep, I think so. I think that's a great call.
Yep.
I bet we'll see another Jiminy Cricket, too.
Yes.
All right, so Geppetto Toymaker is a 5-cost inkable steel character with 3 strength, 3 willpower. He quests for 1. He's a storyborn inventor, so he's a bit understated, so we better see some good abilities here.
You know that's right.
His first ability is Pulling Strings. It says you can exert Geppetto and then choose 2 characters. They deal damage equal to their strength to each other.
Ooh.
And then he has a second ability, A Real Boy. Your characters named Pinocchio gain resist +1.
Heck yeah, I love that.
And he has the flavor text, it's my wish, it's come true.
Oh, Geppetto, he just wants a son.
Yep. So Geppetto, that pulling strings ability could be really great board control for Steel. What I really like about it is that it scales upward as the game goes on. So one of the problems Steel can have is that late in the game, their removal doesn't touch some of your opponent's bigger characters, or if there's a wide board of good characters, you can struggle. You need to cast like multiple Along Came Zeuses.
Yes, and is beautifully character-driven.
Yeah.
As well, you know, he's making these characters do something, and they don't actually have to do anything or make the trade. He's just kind of puppeteering them so that they will do the thing.
Exactly, yeah. So, imagine a scenario where your Ruby Sapphire opponent has a Maleficent Dragon and a Tamatoa on the board, and you can basically have them fight each other and clear the dragon, put 7 damage on the Tamatoa. I think it would be really fun to have this type of card in the game because you do have to wait for Geppetto to exert. Your opponent gets to play around it for sure, but it's a nice kind of cap, a nice limiter, a nice kind of comeback card potentially if it does get to use its ability, if you get to use Geppetto's string pulling.
I love this card. I think it would be a blast to have. I love that he's a 3/3. I love that he doesn't die easily or get brawled or anything. I think he's got some sturdiness to him. Even though he is an old man, I think it's appropriate that it's a rare card as well. I think it's got some solid abilities. I would love to see this. I hope that when we see Geppetto in the game, it is this card.
Katie, next week will be our 50th episode.
Woo! I think that similar to what Disney World did for their 25th anniversary, we should make our home into a cake.
I'm on board. We are,
Okay.
after all, a snack-themed podcast, and the only way to aptly celebrate such a momentous occasion would be to turn all of our furniture and living quarters into cake.
Into a big, bright, pink cake.
We're going to do something really fun for episode 50. We're going to try to go big here. We have some things in the works. Hopefully those shake out. Hopefully we'll be able to have a really excellent 50th episode.
We got a lot of things in our pot here, and we're boiling up a tasty 50th chili.
Thanks so much for listening to us. As ever, you can help us out by reviewing us on Spotify or Apple Podcasts. It helps a lot. You can also subscribe if you prefer to listen via YouTube. And as we mentioned before, if you do want to throw us a tip-top jar at Lorcana is how you can do so. We'd really appreciate it.
All of the tips that we will get from the Tip Top Jar are going directly to the waiters and staff of the Lorcana Cafe. So don't worry. It goes to a good place. As always, folks, please keep on snacking.